Okay, here we go with Chapter 6, Lecture 2. Now, just so you're aware, there will be a short lecture also included after Lecture 2. It's referred to as Lecture 3 in Chapter 6. It's not really a lecture, it's just me using Bailey, my Golden, to show you the difference between operant and classical conditioning. And she does a great job of identifying the different methods of conditioning. So take a few minutes to watch that video when you're done with this one. So we're going to start by talking about Thorndike. Thorndike was an early American psychologist in the early 1900s and 10s. He came up with two ideas that were very different from Pavlov. They were called the laws of effect and practice. The law of effect is a very simple concept. You shouldn't put much thought into it. It's very straightforward. And that is that when a behavior is followed by a positive outcome, the likelihood of that behavior occurring again increases. So, pretty simple. You do something, you get something good for it, you're likely to do it again. That's the law of effect. The law of practice simply says that the more you do that over and over and over, the more likely it is that you're going to get that response again, or that behavior again, I should say. So, that idea that Thorndike gave brought along ideas from B.F. Skinner. Now, B.F. Skinner was the guy who came up with the ideas of positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, positive punishment and negative punishment. Recognize that the difference between classical conditioning, which is Pavlov, and operant conditioning, which is B.F. Skinner, is with Pavlov, you have to institute a stimulus. That's what gets everything going. There is no stimulus presented in operant conditioning. It's a very passive process in which the individual simply waits for the desired behavior and then reacts to it in the way that would either increase the likelihood of it occurring or decrease the likelihood of it occurring. So, going to use the whiteboard here again, and we'll start with what positive and negative reinforcements and punishments are. I'm going to make a little grid here. So, reinforcement over here, punishment here, positive here, negative here. Okay. So, the definition of a reinforcement is anything that follows a behavior that will increase the likelihood of the behavior reoccurring. Hear that again. Anything that follows a behavior that increases the likelihood that the behavior will occur again. A punishment is anything following a behavior that will decrease the likelihood of a behavior occurring again. So, that's reinforcement and punishment. Now we have both positive and negative to go along with reinforcement and punishment. So here's reinforcement, here's punishment, here's positive, here's negative. Okay? So, if it's a reinforcement, what is it supposed to do? Well, if it's a reinforcement, it is supposed to increase the likelihood of the behavior. So, all reinforcements increase the likelihood of a behavior. All punishments decrease the likelihood of a behavior. Okay? Now, we're going to very simply define positive and negative. They are not good or bad. do not get lost in the idea of good or bad, okay, with positive and negative. They are add to or take away from. So, whatever the situation is where you're reinforcing a behavior or punishing a behavior, if it's a positive, you're adding something to the situation. If it's a negative, you're taking something away from the situation. Now, what's that mean? Well, positive reinforcement simply means you're adding something to a situation that increases the likelihood that the behavior will occur again. So what does that mean? That means if little Johnny shares with little Sally when they're playing with toys and he shares a toy with her, you say to little Johnny, "Wonderful for sharing, little Johnny. Here, have a cookie." And it's both the wonderful, giving him praise, and the cookie that you're both adding to that situation. Now, we're going to talk about negative reinforcement in a bit, but we're going to talk about that last because it's the hardest one to understand. Let's talk about positive punishment first. And I know positive punishment sounds weird, but remember, the positive only means you're adding something to it. So in this case, little Johnny and little Sally are playing, and when little Sally wants to have Johnny share a toy, Johnny smacks her with the toy instead of sharing it with her. So you're going to use positive punishment. You're going to add something to the situation that decreases the likelihood that little Johnny's going to smack little Sally in the future. So what do? You pick up the toy and you whack Johnny. No, you don't, because that just perpetuates violence. So what we do instead is we give Johnny work. We make Johnny go clean the toilet. Johnny gets all upset because we've added something, the work, to decrease the likelihood that the behavior will occur again. Then, what would negative punishment be? In this case, we would take away Johnny's toys. We take away his toys to decrease the likelihood that he's going to smack little Sally with a toy again. What then is negative reinforcement? Well, it's a pretty simple concept, really, but you got to follow the steps. So, you're trying to increase the likelihood of a behavior, and you're going to remove something from that situation that is going to decrease the likelihood of a behavior. This is what we do when we ground our children. Grounding is stupid, because all it does is mess with the parents. Kid mopes around all day long and just annoys the parents to death. Now, use positive punishment. Give them work. Give them a certain number of things to do, and they can get it done quick or they can get it done slow, but then their punishment's over. And everybody's back to normal, you know? So, negative reinforcement is what we use in this case because we've punished our kid too much. You're grounded for a month, we tell them. And then we are so upset that we grounded them for a month because they're pains in the rear when you've grounded them for a month. So instead, what we do is we want them to clean. And I know many of you have done this, where you've been grounded and you ended up moping around for 2 or 3 days, and then you sat there in your room and you looked around and the room was dirty, and what'd you do? You started to clean. Well, a lot of people do that when they're grounded. The moment they start cleaning, because cleaning is the behavior you want, in addition to getting rid of the grounding, you tell the kid, "Oh, you wonderful child, you have cleaned your room without asking. I'm going to take a week off of your grounding." Now, you've removed what? You've removed an aversive condition. You've taken it away in order to reinforce the cleaning behavior. And then the kid goes, "Aha!" And what do? Next day, they go clean the kitchen and scrub the floor and everything. You pull off another week. Next day, they go clean the garage. You've gotten rid of 3 weeks of grounding, and the kid only has a day or two left of grounding. And then they come to you and say, "Well, can I get rid of the rest by weeding the garden?" And you tell them, "No, because you got to hold tight, right, and maintain the power." No, but I'll pay you to weed the garden over the next 2 days. And lo and behold, they do that. And now you're positively reinforcing them, giving them money for a behavior that you want to have continue. Okay? So, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment. You need to know those 4 things. There will be questions on your quiz. And this is important for you to understand. This is an important concept. Okay? Now, that being the case, let's move on to our next section. And the next section is schedules of reinforcement. When do you reinforce? Well, that's another grid. And we'll talk about when you reinforce. Okay? Sometimes the timing of the reinforcement is just about as important as the reinforcement itself. So, we have fixed ratio, fixed interval, variable ratio, and variable interval schedules of reinforcement. And here's how they work. Okay? If something is fixed, that means it's the same every time you do it. Keep that in mind. And we have fixed versus variable. That means it changes every time. And then we have ratio, which means it's based on the number of behaviors you've counted. And last, interval, which has to do with an interval of time. So, here's the beginnings of the little grid. Fixed versus variable, ratio versus interval. Okay? How do they work? Well, first you have to understand the concept of a trial.
Pause or keep going?
Look, keep going. You can all say hi to my son. He's the social worker here at the office. And he brought me lunch, so I'm happy he's here. So, what does the concept of fixed really mean in reinforcing? Well, you have to understand the concept of a trial. A trial means you're waiting for the behavior to occur. Remember, this is operant conditioning. You're waiting for a behavior to occur. And then once you get what you want, you reinforce. That is a trial. So, waiting for the behavior until you get the behavior and then you reinforce it. That's trial 1. Trial 2 begins when trial 1 ends. You wait for the next behavior, which is the same one you were waiting for first time around, and then when you get it, you reinforce again. So, a fixed schedule of reinforcement simply means that for every trial, you're looking for the exact same thing. Okay? A variable schedule of reinforcement means that it will change with each trial. Okay? Now, if it is a ratio schedule of reinforcement, then we are expecting a certain number of behaviors. You're counting behaviors. Doesn't matter if it takes 10 minutes or 10 hours, you're counting behaviors. Interval means you're counting the amount of time during which a behavior is happening. So consistent behavior, but you're counting time. All right? Now how does that work? Well, you get 4 options here. there are four possibilities. You can have a fixed ratio. You can have a fixed interval, or you can have a variable ratio, or you can have a variable interval. Just like this. So, what does fixed ratio mean? That means every time little Johnny shares with little Sally, 3 times you're going to give Johnny a pat on the back and a cookie. That is a fixed ratio because it's fixed. It's the same number of behaviors, 3 shares, and it's the same for those number. Okay? That's a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement. A fixed interval schedule of reinforcement would mean little Johnny plays with little Sally for 2 minutes straight. So he's just playing with her. And what you're wanting is play behavior for little Johnny. Let's say little Johnny is high functioning autism spectrum disorder, and you want him to interact with another child. And so he learns that as he plays, he gets reinforced in ways he likes to be reinforced. That would be a fixed interval. Every 2 minutes of play, Johnny gets a reinforcement. Now, what would a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement be? Well, you choose between 1 and 10, and then you randomly assign all your trials. So the first time, the first trial, Johnny has to share with little Sally 2 times, and then you reinforce him. But the second time, he has to share with little Sally 7 times before he gets reinforced. And then the third time is 5, and the fourth time is 1, and the fifth time is 9, and the sixth time is 4, and the seventh time is 8. So you have a different number of behaviors that need to be exhibited for each trial. So it's fixed. Wait a minute. No. That's variable ratio. Sorry to mess you up. So fixed ratio, variable ratio. What's fixed interval? I already told you that. Okay. Now, variable interval simply means that the amount of time that things have to be shared changes with each trial. So if little Johnny and little Sally are just playing, then the first trial, Johnny only has to play for 1 minute to get reinforced. The second trial, he has to play for 6 minutes to get reinforced. The third trial, he has to play for 5 minutes to get reinforced. The fourth trial, he has to play for 9 minutes to get reinforced. So the interval of time that the behavior is occurring changes variably for each trial. You get it? Fixed ratio, the exact same number of behaviors for each trial. Fixed interval, the exact same amount of time that the behavior is happening for each trial. Variable ratio, differing numbers of behaviors for each trial. And variable interval, different amounts of time for each trial before reinforcement occurs. Okay? There is a special name for a 1-to-1 fixed ratio. One behavior, one reinforcement. That's called a continuous schedule of reinforcement. Just information. Okay? That's how you reinforce. And by the way, did you know that every one of you, if you have a job, is being reinforced by one of these methods? Okay? Let's pick them out. What would be a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement? That would be piecework. like working on an assembly line, and they pay you so much money for every widget that you put together on the assembly line. Many factories do this. They hire people, pay them by the hour, and then once they've become proficient, they offer them an opportunity, and the opportunity makes them a whole lot more money. They're able to make 2 to 3 times as much money as other people who just stay on the hourly wage. And they get more widgets out of the deal too, so it works pretty well. That's piecework. What would be a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement? Well, that would be commission sales. It's variable, meaning it changes with each trial, the number of times you have to do the behavior, but you still have to do the same behavior. If you're selling cars in a car lot, you have to give the same spiel to everybody that comes in. You don't know if it's going to be the first one or the 27th one. That's why it's variable. It changes with each trial, but it's the same behavior, and you're counting behaviors. If you're being paid by commission, you are not being paid for the amount of time that you stay there. You're being paid for the number of sales you make, so that's a variable ratio. A fixed interval schedule of reinforcement would be an hourly wage. You're paid so much money for a certain amount of time, an hour in this case, that you do a consistent behavior. That's an hourly wage. And then finally, variable interval. Let's see. What would a variable interval schedule of reinforcement be in the workaday world? It would be a salary. Does anybody who works on salary ever know how many hours a week they're going to work? They never do. Every once in a blue moon it's 32, but most of the time it's 53 or 61 or something like that. It's not 40. And why do they bring the salaried people in when there's an emergency? Because they don't have to pay them anymore. They are making a salary, and they put in whatever time is required to get the job done. So it varies for the amount of time they have to put in each pay period. So, again, you're all paid by one of those systems of payment. Okay, let's talk about shaping. Here's my definition of shaping. It's better than the definition given by your book. The definition of shaping is repeated reinforcement of progressively closer approximations of the desired response. Well, what shaping means is that sometimes we're not just reinforcing a simple behavior. Sometimes we're trying to reinforce a very complex behavior. But complex behaviors don't come easy. So when I was an undergraduate, I took a class called Learning, a psychology class. And in essence, it was this chapter for an entire semester. And we were all given a chicken at the beginning of the class. Well, I named my chicken Fred the chicken. And Fred learned to do a whole bunch of cool things in the Skinner box. Look in your book at the Skinner box. It's kind of a cool concept of a little box that they put an animal in, and as the animal behaves that they should, they shoot little reinforcements down a little chute, and little Fred, he understood. We all had our little chick that was given us at the beginning of the semester. We had to take care of our chick. If our chick died, we flunked the class. Fred didn't die. Fred did a good job. So, how did I teach Fred a behavior? Well, I was supposed to teach Fred how to do a 360-degree turn. Now, those of you who have grown up around chickens, you know that's not a normal chicken behavior. Chickens don't do 360-degree turns. Well, I got little Fred in the Skinner box, and Fred knew about that little hopper where the little chunk of grain came down. And he went up there and he just stared right at that little hopper. He's staring at that little hopper, and then he gets kind of bored pretty quick because chickens have the attention span of a gnat. So he picks his head up, turns his head to the left. Bam! I sent a little piece of grain down the hopper. And he ran in, gobbled it up. It took him 3 times before he figured it out. And he was just going, gobbling it up. Now, what is shaping? Repeated reinforcement of progressively closer approximations of the desired response. Now, what's the desired response? A 360-degree turn. What's a minor approximation of a 360-degree turn? Turn in his head. So he turns his head pretty soon, 10 times in a row. He turns his head, he gobbles, turns his head, gobbles it up, right? And then I stop reinforcing him. So he turns his head and he looks. Nothing there. He turns his head again because he thought he had this figured out, and he looks. 3rd time, he's pissed, and he turns his head really hard, and he moves his foot once. All of a sudden, I've taught him the 1 step. I reinforce him. He gobbles it up. Took him 3 times, and pretty soon, he's just doing this 1-step thing. 1 step, 1 step. And he keeps getting reinforced. Pretty cool stuff. Then, I quit reinforcing him. For just 1 step, I reinforced him for 2 steps, and he got real pissed, and he took 2 steps 1 time. And then he got it, reinforced. Took me 15 minutes, had Fred doing circles in the Skinner box. Well, any of you who have ever worked in a pizza place? It takes a little while to figure out how to make pizzas. You start with stretching out the dough, and then on top of the dough, you add on putting on the sauce, and then you put on the cheese, and then you put on the other stuff. It takes a little while to figure it out. You learn it in a shaping fashion, and then pretty soon you can do a whole pizza all by yourself. Okay? That's shaping. Shaping is a very common behavior. Now, we're going to talk a little bit differently about reinforcers. Primary versus secondary reinforcers. Okay? A primary reinforcer is a biological reinforcer. So it reinforces, for example, food is a primary reinforcer. There are lots of other primary reinforcers. Sex is a primary reinforcer. Physical activity could be a primary reinforcer. There's lots of primary reinforcers. Things that reinforce us for doing the things we ought to be doing. Okay? A secondary reinforcer is a reinforcer that gets its reinforcing properties by its association with a primary reinforcer. So that green stuff that we carry in our wallets, it doesn't have any innate value. It's a piece of paper with some ink on it. Cloth in there too. But that's all it is. It's not much. Why does it have value to us? Because it's associated with biological things we can get for it. So the association between the two gives value to secondary reinforcers. In inpatient programs where people are learning to change their behavior, these things are used a lot. They're given little chips or other things like that that they can redeem later on. Now, we've reached a point that's an important point. That point is we're going to add cognitive theory into behavioral theory. So far, we've just talked about behavioral theory. Now cognitive comes in because really you can't separate behavior from thought. They are integrally connected with each other. What's the line between learning when it's behavioral learning versus cognitive learning? The cognitivist believes that you can learn something and it's inside of you, but you don't have to exhibit the behavior to have learned it. The behaviorist says part of the learning process is the doing of the behavior. And so there's no real learning until the behavior has been exhibited. That very well could be the case. It might be. But there are certain situations where you must exhibit the behavior to have learned it. There are some situations where you don't need to. You can watch a simple behavior and perform it quite well if you were called on. This brings us to the early cognitivists. So Tolman and Seligman, who were originally influenced by some of the earlier cognitivists. Tolman, for example, he came up with latent learning and cognitive maps. Latent learning means you can learn something and it's in there, but you've never shown it before. Well, he did a very interesting study in which he took a great big maze that he ran mice through, and he just divided it right in half. They weren't mirror images of each other, they were just two halves of the same maze. And he had one group of mice run through the one maze, the one side, numerous times. So they knew where the beginning and the end was. And then, after he had done that with one group of mice, he then closed off the right side and opened up the left side and had the mice all, one group that had not done that right side and one group that had done that right side. What would they have been? The group that had done that right side, they were the experimental group. The group that had not run the right side of the maze, they were the control group. And then he ran each mice once through it. Experimental and control mice, one at a time. And which group was able to run the left side of the maze faster than the other group? Well, it was the experimental group, because they knew where the beginning and the end was. They had latent learning. They had never run the left side of the map, but they had orientation, which is considered a cognitive map. You all have a cognitive map when you get in the car and you're going to go somewhere, and in the back of your head you see this little image of where you're going to go. That's a cognitive map. Well, these mice had cognitive maps too. And he showed that that learning had occurred even though no one had run the left side of the maze, just because of the cognitive orientation of where the beginning and the end was. There's Seligman, learned helplessness. Interesting concept, disturbing concept. Seligman put together this big box made out of wood. It was about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, and it was divided right down the middle with a divider. And in the bottom of one of the sides, he had a metal grating, and he took dogs and cats. Never should have done this research. It should never have been done. And he would put the dog and the cat in there, and they had electricity hooked up to the metal grating in the bottom. And he'd start to shock them. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was painful. And they would jump and howl and yell and do everything they could to get out of the way. But they couldn't get out. And so pretty soon, they'd just get into the box, and then they'd just sit there and quiver until the electricity started. And then when they started the electricity, all they'd do is roll over onto their sides. Well, why'd they do that? It's because when they were first trying to scrape and jump and get out, and they couldn't get out, they'd fall down on their backs or fall down on their sides. And in the falling, they figured out that their fur actually made some of the shock not so bad. It was an insulator. Well, poor little animals. Then they took the divider between the two halves of the box, and they cut it down so any dog or cat could just jump over and go to the other side. But they'd put them in there, turn on the electricity, they'd roll over. They'd go in, put them in, pick them up, put them on the other side, pick them up again, back, turn the electricity on, they rolled over. This is called learned helplessness. Does this sound like the battered wife syndrome? By golly, it does, where people learn to feel like they're helpless, even though they're not. But they've been conditioned to believe they are. It's a horrible condition to be in. That's often how depression occurs too. When someone gets hit with numerous things in a very short period of time, they kind of give up for a little while. That's learned helplessness. Sometimes we have to help people we care about out of that learned helplessness. The final thing I want to talk to you about is Albert Bandura and his observational learning. He was a student of both Walter Mischel and Julian Roeder. Roeder actually came up with the idea of social learning theory. Very important theory, actually. Excuse me. The idea that the social norms that we learn are like reinforcements and punishments, kind of exquisitely all put together in a way that we learn a culture. Very interesting ideas. Bandura, though, came up with observational learning. Now, we've talked about him before. We talked about him back in chapter 1. But let's talk about him a little more now. Bandura believed that there was a different way that you could combine cognitive and behavioral principles, or excuse me, that was chapter 11 where we talked about personality theory that we talked about Bandura in. But that we can use cognitive and behavioral principles combined together to create a learning theory. In this case, Bandura believed that there were two cognitive concepts and then two behavioral concepts that went in a row for learning. Now, for his theory, you have a model. That's somebody exhibiting a behavior. You have the behavior, that's 2, and you have an observer, that's 3. The observer is the learner. The model is the one who knows the behavior. The behavior is what the model is teaching the observer. So, how does it work? Well, there's 4 principles. Number 1, attention. The observer has to be attending to the behavior of the model. How much behavior goes on around us that we don't pay any attention to? That is a cognitive concept. Attention is a principle in our minds. 2, retention. That's remember it. Again, we observe a lot of things, but how much of it do we remember in a given day? Not a whole heck of a lot. Okay, that's 2. That's a cognitive concept too, memory. The 3rd principle, reproduction. This is that now that it's been attended to and remembered, the behavior is now reproduced by the observer. And now many people think that's the end of it, but it's not. That's a behavioral principle because you can see the behavior. It's not going on in your brain. You can actually see the exhibiting of the behavior. Again, the line between cognitive and behavioral theory. And then 4 is motivation, which is it reinforcing? Therefore, we find what the reinforcement is and use that reinforcement to continue motivation to exhibit that behavior. Therefore, the behavior is fully learned. And according to Bandura, a person can have an entire personality development occur through those 4 basic principles. So, there you go. Those, I think, are the main, most important concepts of behaviorism and cognitive theory and learning. Now, there are a few other principles right in the middle of the chapter that are interesting. They probably need a little bit more time before they become secure pieces of the whole process of learning. So, that's it for this chapter. Again, look at video 3. Video 3 is Bailey showing you the difference between classical and operant conditioning. And we'll get chapter 7 on the canvas just as quickly as we can. Thank you very much, and good luck, everybody.